Life is like chess, and stories are like books of famous chess games that serious players study so that they will be prepared if they ever find themselves in similar straits. Story proof, page 7.
I thought I recognized that.
I hope you do, Kendall. My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can show your support by either writing a brief review on iTunes or by becoming a patron via interviewthefuture.com. My guest today is Dr. Kendall Haven. Kendall is the only West Point graduate to ever become a professional storyteller. Haven holds a doctorate in Oceanography and spent 8 years as a senior research scientist for the Department of Energy before finding his true passion for what he calls, quote, a very different kind of truth. Kendall is the author of 34 books, but the two most relevant to our conversation today are Story Proof, the science behind the startling power of story, which pioneered and reported on some of the first neuroscientific studies of the brain on story, and was later followed by Story Smart, using the science of story to persuade, inspire, influence, and teach. Finally, Kendall Haven has performed for audiences of over 5 million people for the past 4 decades and has been appointed as a distinguished visiting scholar at Stanford University. So, welcome to Singularity FM, Kendall.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Kendall, you have no idea how excited I am about this conversation. Despite the fact that the second book that we were supposed to be discussing here today has been stuck in customs for over 2 weeks now. So we may have to stay focused on the first book. But then again, I might use it as an excuse to have you back again.
Well, that would be a pleasure. And as we talk, we'll slide through both books and also beyond those books into the research over the last 5-6 years.
Absolutely, absolutely. But let us start step by step at the beginning of the story. So let me ask you this, and perhaps maybe even before the beginning of the story, but with your identity, should I call it, with this question. Kendall, are you a scientist who studies story or a storyteller who is using science to enhance his storytelling?
I will answer it this way. When I was working at the Department of my oceanography degrees, I was working with the Department of Energy at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, leading a little research team looking at the environmental implications of advanced oceanic energy technologies. Every year, we would get, in essence, a contract for that fiscal year, October to October, from the Department of Energy for what we were going to study. And then we would go study it, and at the end of the year, we would have to write reports that would go back to them. And every year, we had to build into our budget time and money for someone, not necessarily me, but someone from the group, to go back to Washington, D.C., march up and down the halls of the Department of Energy and beg anyone to read our reports. And mostly no one ever did. We would have to write a summary, max 3 pages at the front of it, of each report, an executive summary that was a max of 1 page that went in front of the summary, and then what was the name of it? There was another one that had to go in front of that was max of 1 paragraph.
And
we couldn't even get people to read that 1 paragraph summary, even the people who paid us to do the research. In hindsight, this now makes sense to me, but at the time, what they would always say is, take the report, and they like volume, because when they marched up and down the halls and had fights for over budgets with other people, the person who could flop the most number of pages of reports onto the table always won those fights. What they would always say to us is, tell me what it says. And we would think, read the report. And they would say, tell me what it says. They were looking for the story. I always was tempted in the middle of a report to break away from the report and in one page in the middle, suddenly say, he looked up a craggy cliff at the castle walls jutting high above him in the storm clouds, blah, 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 and see if anyone ever picked up on it. I never did it. It turns out that what we were discovering is that information itself is not very influential, not very persuasive. What matters is the way that information is provided into the brain of your target audience, and how well the way that you're providing that information matches the way their brain is hardwired and programmed to process and make sense out of information and then to create meaning from it. So the answer to your question is, I think, in truth, we're all scientists. We're all curious about the world around us. That's science. Science is just a little more formal process to do what it is that we all do. Be curious about the world around us and try to figure out how it works. We're also all storytellers. Every human being, without exception, from the age of year and a half, when you start to pick up language, certainly, uses story as a primary vehicle to get what you want. So we're all telling stories all the time. Wrong question. The question is, are you consciously aware of how you form and structure and deliver your stories? And are you aware of what it feels like when you naturally are using your effective story structure and your effective story delivery, and when you're using your counterproductive, destructive, which we all have and use unfortunately a lot, our destructive, counterproductive storytelling styles and tendencies. So yes, I'm a storyteller who uses science, but I'm also a human being, so that makes me a storyteller. And I think really makes us all de facto scientists. We're just not, most people aren't terribly formal in the way they approach it. How's that for a roundabout answer?
It's interesting because I always want to find out in my interviews how people see who they are and why they do what they do. In other words, I want to find out the story behind their identity and the story of how they became who they are, or they say that they are. So now, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, which I assume is going to lead us to a park in Alameda, and to actually one of those moments of epiphany. I mean, how
maybe
many
if
real
I stop you
epiphanies
before
do
we get to the park in Alameda, because I'm curious even before that. So we want to hear your story, but we don't want to hear the story from you discovering story. I even want to go before that, like, how did you get to West Point and why? Because those are all kind of a little bit, an interesting story is one which is surprising, right? The element of surprise is one of the major elements of a good story, right? So your story, your life story is kind of surprising. West Point, okay, great. Well, then switch to oceanography, and then storytelling. So those are like unexpected turns everywhere.
Yeah, they are. And let me, even before we get to that, a lot of the research that I've been working on the last 4 years now has been looking at how do you control the emotion that people feel at the end of a story? There's a term for it, residual resolution emotion. That is to say that the emotion that you're left with, the residual emotion that you're left with after as a story ends, it turns out that is a prime prime predictor of how impactful and effective that story will be on changing attitudes, beliefs, values, knowledge, that is, say, exerting influence of that emotion. Surprise and satisfaction are the two biggest factors. Surprise is the difference between the actual story and what the audience expected. Expectations are something you can control. The end of the story is something you can control. So surprise is something that a communicator has at their beck and call to manipulate and design and then deliver. Satisfaction is a comparison of the actual resolution to what the target audience would most desire. That desire is not particularly variable. You, the communicator, don't have control over it, but you do have control over, of course, whether your resolution satisfies or doesn't satisfy. And often, if you want to exert influence, one that doesn't satisfy is far more powerful and effective than one that does. But those two factors are prime targets for the design of story as we go forward. So back to your question, why did I go to West Point? I was named after my grandfather. I'm
Who
Kendall
was a general?
Haven. He was a general. So I was told he went to Georgia Tech and always wished he'd gone to West Point instead. I was told from the day I was born that I was going to go to West Point, and like a fool, it never occurred to me to question it.
Wow.
All through high school, I never questioned that I would go to West Point. Never made any other plans. Never considered any other colleges. And so, in hindsight, it's a good thing I got admitted and was selected to go to West Point because I didn't have a fallback plan. So went to West Point, and at the time that I went, I hadn't really seriously realized that automatically you go to West Point, you wind up in the Army. And I knew we wore uniforms at West Point, and that was okay because I hated to decide what to wear when I got up in the morning. But the day you go to West Point, you first, before you're admitted into West Point formally, you join the Army. So you are in the Army while you're at West Point. And afterwards, and it turned out that very quickly I realized that was not the career that I was looking for. It wasn't where my heart felt it was nourished and got any sense of fulfillment. So did my 5 years, and that was my obligation, and then got out. And at that point, either had to get a job or go to grad school. So, of course, going to grad school.
Just out of curiosity, what was your specialty? And I'm not familiar if you have any particular field of expertise or specialty.
When I went to West Point, I was the very first class that had an elective. We had one slot in each semester of our senior year where we had an elective. There were, as I recall, 6 courses that we could pick from for those two. So the answer to your question is no. By act of Congress, when I went, we were all engineers. We walked out with a degree in general engineering.
Wow.
Which I think is a very solid background. It's an approach to problem solving that works for better than most approaches in most situations. So now it's totally different. Now there are majors and whole programs, which is I wish we had had when I was there, but we didn't. So general engineering. And growing up in Southern California, I would, on the weekends, what do? You run down to the beach, you go body surfing. And it occurred to me that if I got a degree in oceanography, one, I'd have to live somewhere near the ocean, which was good. And second, maybe I could get a government job as a paid government surfer, go out and check the wave level and the wave structure every day by doing a little morning surfing.
And call it research.
And call it research, call it what you do. So got my degree in oceanography. but it was actually, more seriously, while I was in the Army, there was a book that I read. It's called The Year of the Whale. It's looking at the first year of life in a sperm whale out in the Pacific Ocean, done as call it a story form. So you're looking at it through the eyes of this sperm whale. Not a particularly great book, but a decent book. And somehow that book just resonated with me. That story captured me, and more than anything else, drove me to saying, I'm going to get my degree in oceanography. Certainly had nothing to do with biological oceanography. My degree was in coastal zone management, physical biology, physical oceanography, and then a little bit of chemical oceanography thrown in with it. So I did coastal zone management work. That is to say, the interaction of human beings and the ocean right along that little strip that we call the coastal zone. And was quite happy to do that kind of work because I could, and I had a good team that I worked with, and working at one of the national labs was certainly pleasurable. But again, there was no passion there. And I didn't at the time even really register that that's what I was lacking and looking for. But there wasn't passion in it. It was just a job.
You still haven't discovered your calling.
Not at that time. So went through the Army, and that wasn't it. Went through oceanography, and that was pleasant, but it wasn't it. And it was, so I'm now in my mid-30s. And that's when we get to that bit of the park. I was at the lab working and met a woman who is now and still my wife, and began to woo, like you do. She had a sister who was a quintessential California hippie girl who had a son. So, being a California hippie girl, it never occurred to her to get married to the guy that got her pregnant. She wanted to, but she just took the kid. And so in order to give the sister a break, when I had some time off and I could take some time off in the afternoon, I'd grab the kid and take him to the park to play, because I was trying to build up woo points with this woman I was wooing. When I got the kid, he was 4. And after a while, and before this is over, turned 5. And we'd go to the park and play. But at some point, in order to give him a break, I'd want to keep him quiet for a little way, get him to sit down and rest. He was a runner. He would get up and run, and just run until he collapsed, and then would turn in, and then suddenly everything would be wrong, and he'd turn into a screaming banshee, and his socks would be wrong, and everything would be wrong, and he'd be wailing, and he'd be miserable to be with, and I wouldn't want to be with him. So in order to prevent that, I'd want to get him to sit quietly for a few minutes, and found the only way I could do it is to say, let's flop into the sandbox there at the park, and I'll tell you a story. And he would flop into the sandbox and sit for a story. And as soon as we started a story, now I'm just making these up as I go along. And my motive was just to keep this 4 or 5-year-old kid quiet for 5 minutes, 6 minutes, as long as I decided he needed to sit. As soon as we started a story, other kids would just materialize. This is back in the 80s. So the assumption was, if you were in a park talking, you were talking to the people in the park, not on your cell phone to people scattered out around the world. So people in and around your vicinity were more interested in listening to the conversation because they thought it maybe applied to them a little more than it would now. So the kids would just zoom in. And then pretty soon, whoever brought them to the park, adults would come over to see why their child was hunkered down in the sandbox with a strange man who wasn't at work in the middle of the day when I should have been. And they would come over and listen and say, oh, he's not doing anything untoward. I don't have to call the police. He's just telling a story. And almost always those adults would stay and listen. Now they came into the middle of a story. So even if it was going somewhere, they wouldn't know where it was going because they missed the beginning. And there was no guarantee the story was going anywhere because I was just making it up. But they would stay. And I started over time, as we had a regular habit of going to the park and going through this routine, I started to watch the adults who would gather. And I'd watch adults walking by, many of them, business suits, carrying briefcases, doing businessy sorts of things, looking very important. And as they'd get within earshot and start to walk by, you could see them slow down and start to lean in and listen, almost like I was, little physics analogy, I was a gravity well, right? And so and they were starting to be drawn in by the gravitational force of the story. And there was a day when it hit me that those adults in that park, listening to stories that I was just making up as I went along with no thought of making the story necessarily make sense, they listened more intently and more deeply than any of the people who were reading our reports listened to those reports. Even though the reports had real value and significance, there was something about the process of story and storytelling that made people listen differently than did researched, quantitative,
Hard science.
presumably very valuable reports.
Yeah.
And so the question was, what in the world was this? Why would people listen to a story differently, more deeply than they'd listen to something else? What was it about story and the process of telling a story that did that? And that's when I first fell in awe of and then in love with this notion of story and storytelling, and quit my job to become a full-time storyteller.
Wow, that's an amazing story, from West Point to oceanography and then storytelling. It's like
Right.
full of surprises, but that's what life is, right? At least good life, anyway. That makes for good stories.
To bring it full circle, as soon as I then declared myself to be a storyteller and wondered if I was inventing something new that the world had never seen, then very quickly, of course, how much there was no course on literature and on story writing at West Point, right? The only art courses we got at West Point were the art of Napoleonic tactics. So, as far as I was concerned, I was inventing something brand new, and then, of course, ran into a whole society of storytellers, people who had been raised in storytelling communities, and there's a whole community of people who did it professionally. So I joined the National Storytelling Association, and turned out I was the first person in this country, in the US, to join the storytelling community with a background, an advanced background in science. So instantly I became the science guy to do the research on why do we listen to stories? What is it that makes us remember stories and information better if that information comes in the form of a story? And by the way, having done a lot of the research after that first contention was made back in the 80s, it's true. We can now demonstrate it very conclusively. You do remember information better if it comes to you housed in the form and structure of a story than if the information comes to you in any other way.
Yeah, I've read reports that you tend to remember information associated with story 22 or 23 times better.
Yeah, that's cute. But that research is woefully inadequate to come to that conclusion. Take the number with a very large grain of salt. The concept is correct. Concept is very viable, but that particular number and the study that they did were way too small and too weakly controlled in order to really have have faith in that particular number.
So what's the
If you were doing
magnitude
it,
then? If 20 times is incorrect, what's the magnitude you would say?
no one's ever really done that research. I would rather say that there is a very significant advantage
Hmm.
to putting information in story terms.
You see, you're a good, cautious,
There are
precise
so many
scientist,
variables.
like a good engineer. You don't want to fudge the numbers. You don't want to accept anything that's not double and triple checked.
Well, we don't want to fudge the numbers because there's real truth there in the statement, in the core concept. And as soon as you try to fudge the numbers, then people can attack the numbers and thereby discredit the whole concept. The concept is valid. The concept is rock solid. And if it's 5 times more, if it's 3 times more, my goodness gracious, to say that you're 3 times more likely to remember something if it comes to you in the form of a story, that would be phenomenal. If you were to say you're 30% more likely to do something if it comes to you in the form of to remember something and have it recall readily into your conscious mind so that you act on it, so that it influences your behavior. If you're 30% more likely to do it if it came to you in the form of a story, that would be a tremendous advantage. That would be earth-shaking. So the 22 times thing, I don't even think the people who did that study were serious with that number, but the concept is rock solid and is worth remembering.
Well, I appreciate the correction, and which is the reason why we have you here today, because you have a very solid scientific and engineering background, and you're very precise and specific. I am not a scientist as a background. I'm more of a philosopher. And in this specific occasion, as it would become pretty apparent, and my audience already knows that, for good or for bad, I already have an agenda. And now, generally,
Good.
also, I tend to accept the most studies at face value because, again, I'm not a scientist, but you are. So you can tell me which ones are the more reliable studies and which ones are not. And just in a minute, I'm going to ask you to share with us your studies that you conducted. But just before that, the last question is about that, what you called very different kind of truth that you discovered. Can you give it to us? What is it, Kendall? What is that, quote, very different kind of truth?
I'm often, when asked that question, I often picture this moment, this scene. Picture a courtroom, and a witness is on the stand and being grilled by an attorney. And the attorney says, "Were you or were you not in that, in that bedroom at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the 24th?" And the person says, "Yeah. Well, I was, but you have to understand that's not, that's not what it means. They're looking at 2 different kinds of truth. One is a physical, factual truth, and the other is looking at the significance and the implications of that fact. So one kind of quote unquote truth is really physical fact. The other kind of a deeper kind of truth is looking at the significance and the meaning to human beings of physical fact, physical event. And so that those two often are for whatever agenda people have, are often separated. And people, like in a courtroom, want to look at just the physical facts of things. But juries, for example, in that same courtroom will make all their decisions on the human deeper truth. They'll interpret, what does it mean? What is the significance of it? they'll look at motives. Why did something happen? Not what happened, but why did it happen? And it is that kind of truth that stories get at. Stories tend to use physical fact, that kind of truth, as vehicles to communicate that deeper kind of truth that gets at motive, that gets at meaning. Whereas hard science tends to say, well, we'll deal with the physical facts and leave the interpretation of them up to someone else.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Stoic philosophy, and Epictetus says it is not the events in our life, but the stories that we attach to those events
Yep,
that make them good or evil.
exactly. I would completely agree with that. And I would say that now when we look at the science of what happens inside the human brain when either experiential information comes in through sensory organ, that could be experience, that could be something you do, something, read something, hear something, see something. So information is getting into the brain through some sensory organ, uh, and then two things happen. One, you have to make sense out of it.
Yeah.
It has to physically make sense. And that, by the way, is why magic works, is because they're manipulating that process of sense making so that in order to make it make sense to you, you assume something happened that physically shouldn't have happened, hence magic. And then having made it make sense, the mind has to say, what does this mean to me? Has to create meaning. And that uh, individual make sense version of the original source material, the experience or the material that came in through a sensory organ, that self-made make sense version is the one that we use to create meaning. And then that make sense meaning version is what gets stored in the brain in short-term and then long-term memory. It's not the actual events. It's not the actual source material. If you you see something, you read a story, you hear a story, it's not the source material that gets into your brain. It's your own self-made version of it that makes sense to you, that then creates meaning for you. That's the version that gets stored in your brain. So that communication, effective communication, is all about trying to control that internal process that each person goes through of making this make sense version of information, and then controlling how the individual then creates meaning from it, because it's the meaning that drives change in attitude, belief, values. It's the meaning that drives behavior. So that impact has to do with the meaning,
Not the event
well,
or the information itself.
not the original event or information.
Exactly. Well, so I think it's time for us to start digging into the science. Here's your book. It is called Story Proof: The Science Behind the Startling Power of Story. It's fantastic. I have so many places where I've used my marker and have taken notes in the margins. So let's start first with the science behind it, because after all, we have to talk about that as the foundation of everything that's in the book. I think the question here is, can you perhaps describe some of the neuroscientific and cognitive tests that you conducted yourself to study the brain on story here, so that we and maybe even some of the ones that you referred to that matter mostly, perhaps, because I think you quote something like, what is it, 1,100 studies in 16 fields of science?
I think it's about 1,400. There may be some that didn't make it into the book, but yeah. So first, it was I was doing a workshop in NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. It's in Maryland, one of the big NASA centers, and working with their science writers, and was promoting to them a real conscious and cognitive use of story and the elements of story structure. And as I finished, a man approached, a lot of people approached, being a science center, it's usually pretty casual dressed. This person was in a three-piece suit, which meant that he was top management. It turns out he was from headquarters of NASA headquarters, which was inside the Beltway. Goddard is outside the Beltway, so they get to be pretty casual and informal. And he said to me, he said, "So you say that story is a better format for us to use in our reporting?" And I said, "Yep, that's the conclusion." He said, "Prove it."
Wow.
And it occurred to me that it was intuitively obvious to me, but could I prove it? So I said, "Yeah, no problem. Yeah, you want to prove? I'll prove it," having no idea whether I really would or not. And I suspected at the time that what I would do is gather up anecdotal information. Go to teachers, go to ministers, go to all of the people who I knew used stories, and spend a fair amount of time going. And if I could get a couple of thousand of those people to all testify, in effect, for the power of story, that given enough anecdotal information, it becomes admissible evidence. I thought that was what I'd do. But first, I wanted to look at what was in the literature. So this is like doing another dissertation, spent a year or year and a half trying to go through the literature, and that's the product of that is the book Story Proof. Looking at 16 different fields of science, from the obvious ones, literature-based ones, to all the neural sciences, to behavioral sciences, to history, to everything that I could find. And the conclusion of that work was that all of those fields, even though none of them were looking at story specifically, all came to the same general conclusion. They didn't use the same terms. It was that story dominates the way that human beings make sense of the world. So that then launched, I was able to take that and launch actually getting funding, which is the big challenge in doing any science research, is actually getting someone other than yourself to pay for it, to do some real experiments. So what experiments do you do? What I wanted to do was go into a lab, EEG, fMRI labs, where I could wire up audiences and watch their brains when I would deliver to them very carefully controlled information, controlled in this way. So I would take those elements of story, the specific elements of story that we were pretty sure by 2010, this is when this research started, were the ones that were the dominant controlling elements that define the structure of story. Isolate those and then be able to see in the responses that we got on the, say, EEG charts, which ones of those really did control the way that people responded to story. Well, of course, the problem is then that's not at all the way that neurosciences have started out. They don't look at story. They're looking at how the brain functions. So, for example, we had to spend 6 or 7 months looking at how do you identify on an EEG graph and all those little squiggly lines that come off of it when you have 24 channels of different probes that are
Electrodes.
glued and attached to the head, those little electrodes. How do you interpret those to say he's engaged? He is emotionally involved. He is moved. He is empathetic. He believes in this particular. He is believing at this point. So we had to find neural signatures that could relate back to what was going on in the story. And then we had to find language to use so that I could say, I want to look at the effect of motive, character motive on believability of character and identity, the way they identify with character. So we're suddenly using those signatures plus taking swabs of mouth swabs, saliva swabs, and so we can get at dopamine releases and other chemical releases that
Hormones.
don't show up on an EEG scan,
Yeah.
but that we can relate to moments like trust and empathy. So we then had to say, how do we deliver the story? Well, of course, being a live storyteller, I said, well, I'll tell the stories to each audience. Of course, the trouble is you never quite tell the story exactly the same way twice. So we had to abandon that and go to video recording the stories, which meant that we had to have a series of experiments then to compare the way that an audience responds to a video of a story to the way they respond to the live telling of the story. So we could eliminate the effect of the media, the change in medium, right, on the audience. So we then so this then became about a 3.5 year effort to then be able to get to a point where we could start to run audiences through stories. And given a story, I'd maybe create 80 different versions of the story.
Wow.
Where I take each of the major variables: character descriptions, goals of the character, motives of the characters, reactions of the characters, and have slightly different, and so create different versions of each of those parts that we could then piece back together to form different strings of stories. Change audiences, change one element. So they get exactly the same story except for one little part. Maybe in a 10-minute story, we're changing a couple of sentences in the middle, and then watching the effect of those sentences play out on the EEG printouts and those neural signatures that we could identify for the rest of the story. And then we do post-story interviews to get their reactions to the characters. How do you feel about the character? How do you trust the characters? Will you like this character? How believable is the character? How interested are you in those kind of things? To work up their response to the story. How influential, how impactful do you think the story was? How moving was the story? And then we wait 3 months and bring those audiences back, wire them back up, and have them tell us the story they heard.
Wow.
Presumably they haven't heard it in 3 months. And the question is, after 3 months, one, do they reasonably accurately repeat the story? Did it get into them deeply enough so they could repeat it? It's still there.
What's the retention?
in their short-term memory, in their active memory. And second, when we look at the EEG signatures, do they re-experience the same or similar emotional roller coasters, emotional trends that they experienced when they first heard the story? And if they could recall it, so if they've retained the story, and if they still experience that emotional surge that goes with the story after 3 months, then we can say that that story is a truly impactful, influential story. And then we can look at patterns for what are the elements in the story that make a story more impactful. We start to build up images of what the human brain thinks, how the human brain is impacted, and then relate the function of the human brain back to the elements of story. And what made this so impactful, so valuable, is that studies of stories have been going on for thousands of years, right? Back to Aristotle, back to the Greeks, but always it has been the format of those studies has been to look at the stories and say, here's a story. I know it had an effect on an audience, so let me look at this story. What they can't look at that way is what about that story had an impact on an audience. And yet that's what you need to know. Not did this story have an impact on an audience, but what about the story? What particular elements of the story? What is it that actually had that impact? It's like looking at a tapestry and saying, "Wow, that's a great tapestry," but it's a whole different level of understanding to be able to tear that tapestry apart thread by thread and decide exactly what's the contribution of each of those threads to that overall impact.
Yeah, it's like when you have a car, which in the beginning people would call a horseless carriage, right? You are not
Sure.
just showing the horseless carriage, you're breaking it apart and showing how it works, why it works, what is the engine, which are the main parts, how does it convert, chemical energy into kinetic energy, and how the whole process works. So that's fantastic, and we're going to jump into the major findings in a second, perhaps. But before that, let me just ask you. You mentioned that you run those studies for about 3.5 years, 4 years. So I just want to get a sense of sort of the duration and the scale, because if you're running 80 versions of a story, how many people did you have to run through those studies, and for what period of time?
Over time, in the EEG fMRI labs, now, as soon as you walk into a lab, then the meter starts to run, and you're running up huge budgets. So you try to be very, very efficient when you're actually in the lab. I would say we ran through, we're in the range of several thousand people actually through that whole process. To the extent that I could, I would do adjunct research off the lab. And as soon as we'd get theory, we'd get findings, we'd get patterns from the lab work, then I'd take it out and work with live audiences to isolate and look at specific patterns. For example, if I, take a quick little story. A boastful peacock, this is a play off of one of Aesop's fables. A boastful peacock scoffed at the crane's, the dullness of the plumage of a crane. That's the first sentence. I've done this study with probably now about 8,000 people and lots of different stories, where I'd say, give them that first sentence and say, okay, tell me, what's the story about? Who's the story about? What's going to happen at the end of the story? And see if, even though often much of that information isn't in the first sentence.
It's about the peacock who's going to learn a lesson.
Now, and if I asked you why you said that and made you track it back to a word, what word would you say is the word that made you understand what that story is about?
Boastful.
Yep. And so what we're looking at is you interpreting the motives, the drivers, the attitudes, beliefs, values of a character, and saying they are antithetical to mine. So that character, therefore, has to be, needs to learn a lesson, needs to change in order to be more like I think the character should be like. You also thought it was about the peacock because it was the first character mentioned. So there are these kinds of patterns that we can pick up that give then very articulate, specific, and powerful cues to someone who wants to communicate more effectively, knowing how the brain of their audience is going to make sense of the information that they get. So a lot of that I could do offline. And I mean, offline being not in an EEG lab where I'm running up a huge budget. So I would try to maximize the number of times that I could take the research and take it out of the lab and work with individual audience members and make sure that we had enough people go through the research so that the results that we had and the patterns that we picked up from the research were solid enough and statistically relevant enough so that the numbers we could come up with, we could say were with much more confidence than that 22 times more effective if it's in a story kind of a number.
So if you were to give us so imagine we're in Washington and you are to give us the major findings in a paragraph or so. What were the major findings of that kind of multi-year, multi-thousands of people kind of research?
Okay. Summary research. Summary result is absolutely the human brain is hardwired from before birth to make sense of incoming information in very specific story terms using very specific story-based models, and that we now know what all of those elements are and how they combine to exert influence, so that we can now develop algorithms, and that's kind of what I've been working on the last couple of years, is developing actual algorithms that can forecast for a given target audience as you develop the story, or once it's developed, if we want to assess it, how exactly influential it will be.
That's kind of scary a little bit, but before I...
And on that sense, absolutely it is, which is one of the reasons that I haven't done any publishing in the last 3 or 4 years, is the question is, so who there are lots of people and organizations I would prefer not to have this information.
Yeah, because that's what kind of Facebook has been trying to do to us, I think, which is to say exactly what you said, develop algorithms to influence us.
And of course, they're doing it for their own purposes. My goal is, and this is actually what I'm trying to create, is a vehicle to arm, ultimately, I would like to arm every human being in the world with an understanding of how story works. So education departments is one of my prime targets, although in the last 20 years, education departments in the United States have been overwhelmingly non-responsive as they have drunk the Kool-Aid of standardized testing.
Yeah.
But if people understand how stories work, it's not that they will be less powerful, it's that they will understand when someone is trying to exert story-based influence over them and manipulate them in a way that isn't to their best interest. Stories are powerful. Stories are frighteningly, terrifyingly powerful. When I teach courses in storytelling, that's one of the places we start, is that you are now wielding an immense amount of power, and that means that you're responsible for wielding it in a socially responsible, productive way. So stories always have been powerful, and there are people who have naturally stumbled into ways of using story that have had incredible destructive, counterproductive effects on the world. That's not going to change until a vast majority of the population of the world understand how stories work and understand when they are being manipulated, and so can look at it more thoughtfully and not be as easily manipulated as has happened in the past, and to a large extent is happening right now.
Are stories, because you said stories are a very powerful tool, are stories not the most powerful tool?
I suppose it would. This is the science of me talking.
Yeah, that's why I'm
And then
asking,
we have
because I
to
want to
know.
see. I have an answer already, but I want to hear yours.
Well, I would say that having well, say a 10,000 megaton asteroid slam into Earth and destroy all life, that's pretty powerful. So the question is, what sorts of realm and what sorts of measures are you using for power? If you're talking about influencing the human beings, then I would say story is the most effective, most powerful vehicle for delivering messages into the conscious mind memory of human beings that exists. Yes. If you're talking about non-human species, yeah, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. We don't know yet. If you're talking about, is a hurricane more powerful than a story? Well, you're using different metrics. So,
Well,
in a practical sense, though, you cannot. There is no way to deliver messaging, deliver information, deliver concept to a human being that matches the power of forming that into the structure of a story and delivering it that way. When I use the word story here, a more correct term would be effective story. So many of the quote unquote stories that we run into have absolutely no effect because of the way they're structured. In fact, the research that I and others have been able to do, the best estimate, the best approximation that is now available is 98+% of all of the quote unquote story-like material that impinge on you have absolutely no effect on you at all. They go in one ear and out the other. They in one eye and out the other. You never even remember that you were exposed to them. The question is, what is it that tiny percentage that do exert influence, what do they hold in common? And what they hold in common is an adherence to the structural elements of effective story, these elements that come out of the research, and use those elements so that they make sense in the human mind the way the communicator intended for them to make sense, and that they then generate the meaning in the human mind that the communicator intended for them to make.
Now, when you said we can't compare necessarily, but let me give you this kind of a story scenario. So you did give the asteroid example, which could be a dinosaur killer or a life killer, like an extinction causing asteroid.
Yep.
But we can accomplish the same with a story, can't we? Because we can create the context within which nuclear weapons wipe out all life on Earth. And you can't have that without story. In
Yes.
fact, the very existence of those weapons was created within a context of a particular story, without which we may not have even had the weapons, and surely we would not have used them as we did use them.
Right. And so that what the story more than anything has done is what the story of atomic weapons. Certainly atomic energy, we'll look at atomic energy, the development of atomic energy, right? Did spin in several different directions. Sure. Very, very medical applications. Certainly the electrical energy production, and then the bombs. The story that dominated the thinking of those people who had the ability to sway the direction of research and development. Yep, that determined where that where the physical understanding and the science would go. Yep, absolutely true. But at the same time, um, what story changes human thinking, and so therefore directs changes in behavior. And the good news is that there's nothing inherent in the existence of an atomic bomb that is detrimental to human beings. It's whether we use them, and if so, how we use them. We could run a scenario where a nuclear detonation is what, and this has been done in movies, a couple of them, is what prevents that asteroid from attacking the Earth, right? So a nuclear explosion isn't necessarily automatically a bad thing. You're right though. Stories control. We are really homo narratus. We're story animals. We are controlled by story. Our thinking is controlled by story. At such a fundamental level that we're not even aware of it.
You said that that's true even before birth, even.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
There's been some research. I haven't done any of this research, but there is some that's been done on babies as young as 3 months old, where they'll start to recognize, and you're looking at eye movement. You're looking at how long they stay focused on something. Given some visual information in front of them, that they will start to respond consistently to those core elements of story, character, action of character, look for goal, have some sense of when something should come to resolution, character, goal, action. Those simple story-based elements so they definitely predate the acquisition of language.
But still, those are after birth.
After birth, but but certainly predate the acquisition of language, so that they are there in the very earliest stages of the developing mind. And we can see when we go into EEG labs, we can now physically, watching what little micro centers light up when we control the information that's coming in to isolate major story elements, character-based information, goal, motive, struggles, risk, danger, those things. What we can do is we can actually see the specific little micro centers that register with those particular story elements, so we can start to map this that network, that neural story net, and locate it. So here, what we can say is that when information comes in through a sensory organ, it doesn't go straight to your conscious mind. We think it does, but it doesn't. There's an amazing amount of pre-processing that happens at a subconscious level to information that comes in through sensory organs. A good example is reading. You read something, words don't go down the optic nerve into your mind. What goes down the optic nerve is more like the dot pattern, from the old style TVs that had that cathode ray gun. That gun literally shot information to each individual pixel on a TV screen, which said light up or don't light up, and set it first with black and white TVs. It was an on-off thing. Then with color, it gave that information to 3 different color layers, right? And then it moved to the next pixel and then because it did it very fast across thousands and thousands of individual pixels on the screen, for us, on the other side of the screen, it looked like a picture, it looked like a moving picture. It's that same sort of information that goes down the optic nerve. And we can see these little processors in the lower back part of the brain, in the subconscious part of the mind, that piece those dots back together and say, oh, this is a line. And then sends that information to another little micro center that says, I recognize that line, we call it a letter or a number or a symbol, right? And sends that back to a processor that says, well, there are a whole bunch of those all pieced together before there's a blank space. Do we recognize that? That goes to a dictionary word, to dictionary processor that says, it's a word, I know that word. So you're not consciously aware of any of this processing. At the same time that processing is going on, we can see these little story-based microcenters light up, which means that at the same time that we are doing that initial subconscious processing, we are also converting this information into story terms, that is to say, making sense of it in story terms. That happens before the information gets to the conscious mind, not after. This neural story net, this story-based processing happens between the outside world and your conscious mind. Information doesn't get into the conscious mind without going through that story-based processing. That's why our brains are so story-dominated, is because we have set it up. Our brains set it up for whatever purpose, however many tens of or hundreds of thousands of years ago, so that information would come in, get processed into story form, and then go to the conscious mind. And then we try to make sense of it and create meaning from it.
Wow, that's so powerful. And it's so deep down on the processing level. It's not even at the conscious, but way down in the subconscious level. And
Way down.
the lower brain here is like one of the oldest structures of the brain.
The oldest.
Right?
It is.
So
Absolutely.
was that then for you the biggest surprise of those studies, or was there anything else that you would call the biggest surprise?
For me, the biggest surprise was one, and actually it's my wife first asked me this question. And I remember the day I was standing behind a little couch next to our front door, and she said, so what happens? This is when I was researching story, nearing the end of researching story proof. And she said, so what happens if you find out that you're wrong? And by that time, I had been doing workshops for a good decade and telling people, here's the way stories work. Here's the structural elements of story. Do it this way. Do it this way. And until that moment, I hadn't really stopped to think, okay, what do I do if I now find out, as I'm piecing all this 1,500 studies together, if I piece all those together, coming from all these different fields of science, if it leads me to a different conclusion, what do I say to all those people I've been preaching the power of story structure to for a decade? And actually, the biggest surprise, I would say, was not only that the research agreed with me, but it was how incredibly tightly the terms and the individual conclusions of individual studies meshed up with what we're saying are the major structural elements of story. Those that we had in the 80s and early 90s, just in looking at getting other storytellers to do little experiments for me to test audiences and test reactions to live audiences. We had built up a very large body of anecdotal information to say, here's how stories work. Here's what an audience really responds to. Now to find that coming from the research world, we were getting exactly the same conclusions. That was probably the biggest surprise, but also an amazingly powerful thing to be able to conclude and to come to and say that, yeah, when you're working out in the real world with live audiences, you come to the exact same conclusion that you do when you're doing research in labs, in universities, and it doesn't even matter what field it is you think you're researching. All of it coalesces around this very specific body of story-based elements.
Yeah, it's like a comedian who goes into a bunch of nightclubs and does comedy. They don't hook up people to fMRI. So in the best case, when they're sifting through their jokes, all they have is the anecdotal evidence
Right.
based on the feedback or response from the audience that they encounter every night. And so they can
Right.
do a joke, and if the joke, is dead 2 or 3 times in a row, you throw away that joke, obviously. And
you
if
throw
a
it away.
joke keeps
Now-
making people laugh, their heads off, then obviously, but they don't actually hook people up
you
to
see-
fMRIs.
No, but if you're a new comedian coming up and you look at an established comedian and say, he does that joke and it always works. So I should say that joke or ones like it will always work for me. Well, that's not true at all.
Yeah.
The question is, what about that joke? Is it the context where the comedian puts it in his whole program? Is it the delivery, the way he did it? Is it something about the audiences that comedian typically faces that makes that joke work? Is it some element in the joke?
Great point.
So a new comedian would want to know, ideally, not only does that joke work, but what makes it work, so that they can decide, will that or similar jokes work for me, or can I take those same elements and make them work for me? That's the idea of doing the research.
That's where the science can be so useful. Yeah.
That's where it comes in.
So, Kendall, we've been talking now for an hour, and I think it's time for us to define our terms here. So, what is story? How do you define story?
Actually, when I do workshops, if we have time, that's a wonderful game to play. I'll have everyone in the audience define story, and my role will be to tear their definitions
Let's
apart.
Let's do it. I'll give you my working definition, and you tear it apart, please.
All right, sure. And then we'll go on to what I think is a more productive definition.
Excellent.
Go ahead.
I'll just read 2 or 3 paragraphs of my kind of draft here on defining story. And so we started our thought experiment with Kenneth Burke's definition of story as equipment for living. Burke offers a great start, but it is Jeff Deschambault who really brings all the essential elements together in defining story as, quote, information processing technology. And whether we realize it or not, it is among the oldest, most powerful, and longest-lasting technologies we have. So let us break it apart and take a closer look to see how and why Deschambault's definition works so well. The first thing we ought to note is that story is about information. It started around the cognitive revolution 70,000 years ago, when we had no writing, and story was the vehicle that carried information from one person to another, one generation to another. Then we invented writing and moved from the oral to the written word. Story got even more powerful because we could suddenly send information both across time and space. Now, the second is that story is about processing. That is, organizing the information in a way that provides new insight that we did not have before. In other words, a story can take data and make sense of it. So it turns information into knowledge, because there is a point to using story, a lesson to be learned. It is for this reason that Walter Benjamin notes, the value of information does not survive the moment in which it was new. It lives only at that moment, and it has to surrender to it completely and explain itself to it without losing any time. A story is different. It does not expand itself. It preserves and concentrates its strength, and it is capable of releasing it even after a long time. And finally, the third part of the definition is that story is technology, because story is a conceptual tool created by Homo sapiens. For example, Kevin Kelly defines technology as anything useful invented by a mind. For Angus Fletcher, technology is any human-made thing that helps us to solve a problem. As any good tool, we can apply story to many a problem to help us understand, make sense of, and deal with it. No story, no way to organize information, no way to process it, no way to make sense of, remember, or understand. Because story is ultimately about understanding and solving problems. So what do you think? My definition of story as information processing technology.
I would say those are very apt characteristics of story. But do they, a definition defines boundaries. That's what a definition does. Defines boundaries. And so boundaries are about saying what isn't as much as they are about saying what is a story. And most people define story in one of two ways, either by saying characteristics of story, this is what stories do, or by talking about their experience of story, the effect of story. What you're doing there is more the characteristics of story. And when we look at, then the question is, are there things that would meet that definition that we would consider to not be story?
Yes.
So information, processing, technology. Is a telephone, and I'm thinking now of an old dial phone, is that a story? It does take information and process it, and it is certainly technology. I would say that characterizes story, but does it uniquely characterize story?
Yes. It's a fair criticism which says that basically my definition is not specific enough, because there may be many other candidates that fit within that definition, but are clearly not what we would call story.
Not what we mean. So and here's where we run into the problem is definitions, like everything else, if they're to be effective, serve a purpose. They tell us something. And so the question is, what is it we're looking for out of a definition of story? And so that then opens up to there being different kinds of definitions. For me, what I want to know about story is I want a definition that explains why and how story exerts the power that it exerts, the influence that it exerts. And so what I'm looking for in a definition is a way to identify the characteristics of story that are responsible for that incredible power. And so if I was to define story, it would be a narrative presentation of character-based information presented so that it provides the essential bits of information required by the human brain in order to make sense of the information and create meaning from it as intended by the communicator. Now, that really is a definition of an effective story. And so I'm ignoring those things that most generally get classed as stories, but that aren't at all effective. I would say it's possible to have a story where there is no intended real information being transmitted. It's just a silly, fun story. However, those things work because the human being is a meaning-seeking animal, and our brains, as soon as they make sense out of something, will always then say, what does this mean to me? What meaning can I glean from this? So whether or not there's any meaning intended by the communicator, it's going to be inferred and created by the receiver. Story then is the vehicle. Story really isn't the message. Story is the vehicle that transmits information. So it's not the information itself. It's the way that you organize the information as a vehicle designed to effectively transmit that information into the conscious mind and memory of a human being.
In military terms,
that's what stories
as
do.
you say sometimes, story is the missile and message is the warhead.
Yep.
Let me read your definition from page 79 verbatim, and give you another one which comes close to it, because I have actually collected probably 7 or 8 definitions of story in the course of the last year or so during my research.
And what you'll find is that there are different stories, there are different very valid definitions of story collected and created for a specific purpose. It turns out that even definitions, in order to have meaning, need to have purpose.
Sure, of course.
Which is a story-based, by the way, a story-based concept.
Right, and so within the story of me doing my research and writing my next book, these your definition and the definition of Lisa Cron are my favorite stories definitions. So your own definition from page 79 here in Story Proof, and I have to say, you go more than halfway through your book before you actually finally give us the definition, which was an interesting approach. But you say there on page 79, quote, a detailed character-based narration of a character's struggles to overcome obstacles and reach an important goal. That's your definition of story.
And that's what I'm trying to do there is, when I just was talking to you, I was being more general. That characterizes, uses those core elements of story, the essential elements of story, as the defining terms. Characters. It's more a description of what a story is, than a defining. So although I use it as a definition, it really technically is a description. That's what it is. It's a character-based narrative presentation of what that character does, their struggles, facing risk and danger, to overcome problems and conflicts in order to achieve a goal that's important to them, all presented in sufficient detail so that the mind of the receiver can visualize and make sense of it as intended. Those are and really then what we're looking at are using that as a framework, as a scaffold onto which you attach the specific details and events of your story. But that scaffold gives that story form and shape, and the ability to then make sense to the receiver.
And a very similar definition given by Lisa Cron in her fantastic book Wired for Story is, quote, a story is about how what happens, that is the plot, affects someone, that is the protagonist, in pursuit of deceptively difficult goal, that is the story problem, and about how that person changes internally in order to solve the problem.
And the only thing I'd never liked about, and I've told her this, that internal change, I can show you a whole lot of very effective stories in which the main character doesn't change at all. Hopefully, what she really is referring to, not hopefully, if the story works, what she's referring to for that internal change isn't in the character, it's in the receiver of the story. So that change happens, the story then affects the receiver of the story in some way, so that what you're looking at is changes in attitudes, beliefs, values, understanding within the receiver, because again, there are very many very effective stories in which the main characters, and that's really what she's following there, is in that definition, is the main character, don't change at all. They're exactly the same at the end that they were at the beginning. But what changes is the way that the receiver of the story views that character and views the world around in the story. So, and I've actually told
Yeah,
that to
and you
Lisa.
say many times that stories are like magic tricks. They really happen in the mind of the audience, not in the magician hands,
Yeah.
or on the page of the book, or in the mouth of the storyteller. They happen in the minds of the audience, of the listener, of the viewer. Yeah, which is a great point, and that's a key point to understand, and I think a fair criticism to Lisa's definition. But another definition of yours that I like, perhaps even more because of its 3 word short, it's so brief, of story, is that
Characters.
Story is characters at war.
Characters
Yeah,
at
that's
war.
very West Point, isn't it?
Yeah, my wife doesn't like that one.
I love it.
But it doesn't have to be. Well, she doesn't like it. She doesn't like war.
Oh, I don't. Yeah,
And I'm using a very wide definition here of war. War doesn't have to be. You can be at war with yourself. You can be at war with war is, what is a war? It is when when
Conflict,
you struggle, facing risk and danger to overcome problems and conflicts to achieve something, a goal. And if you're going to willing to go to war, that something, that goal is important to you, motive. So yeah, really, that's the essence of stories, is characters at war.
Let me pull one of the other elements here that I think is very important, and kind of perhaps I'm over relying or overemphasizing that element in my failed attempt to define it, or to borrow Jeff Deschambault's definition. And I took that from Story Proof, page 13, where you say the similarity of store and story is not coincidence. Stories are our universal storehouse of knowledge, beliefs, values, attitudes, passions, dreams, imagination, and vision. So this is the information processing part that I was talking about. So say more about that. And am I, because clearly I think maybe I'm way overemphasizing that part.
Yeah. No, actually you're not. A lot of this research came out of the anti-smoking research, and researchers would compile massive amounts of data and anecdotal information and case study information to show the dangers of smoking, and show it to people who are over and over again to people, and and often then the people to whom they show it would say, "Wow, yeah, I agree completely. Wow, smoking is terrible. You mind if I light up while we talk about it?" And what researchers found, and this isn't my research, a lot of other people have found, is that our deepest core values and beliefs are housed in story form, and we tend to defend those core stories from attack, and we'll not only do it vehemently, we'll do it to the death. So that what happens is we tend to interpret incoming information in order to support and reinforce our existing core beliefs. And so how do you do that? Well, goodness gracious, look at the 2020 presidential election in the United States. What happens is, if you don't like the conclusion that someone came to, in order to maintain your belief, you discount the source of the information, or you accept without actual much
You
analysis.
find the most favorable interpretation
some,
of the data that fits within your story, pre-existing story.
well, actually, you start with the conclusion. You start with
Yeah.
the interpretation, and then force the data to support it, so that what, yeah, from, I mean, we can track the development of complex language back easily 150,000 years. And that, and again, I haven't done any of this research, but the people that have looked at it, and now I'm glad someone has been able to show that for virtually all that time, we have stored all of the societal information, history, beliefs, values, factual information in human memory, because there's no other place to store them, right? If it didn't get stored in human memory, it didn't get stored, period. The oldest lithographs on cave walls date back to what, 35,000 years ago, the ones in France. And they're about the oldest ones that are known. Now, maybe there were some older ones, but certainly for the majority of human history with complex language, information has been stored in language form in the human brain. And people have been able to show that mostly that's been done in story form. That's the vehicle that we use. And either it is that people decided to use story, and that over time the brain evolved to process information in story terms, or that the brain had already been evolved to process in story terms, and people started to use story because that's what worked. And it's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Well, either way, we have now what we have. We have chickens and we have scrambled eggs, and that's the reality that we have been dealt. And it may be that complex language goes back to about 350,000 years ago, based on some skull fragments that have been found in Africa, that there's a bulge in the back of the skull, which is where the language center is. And the advent of complex language in human beings coincides with the development of that bulge in the back of the skull. So the question for anthropologists, some of the researchers, was, can we find skulls that predate and then just the first ones that show that bulge? And there's some from Africa that are about 350,000 years old that may show that bulge, that may say, well, complex language developed sooner than we thought it did. But either way, where we are is that as language developed, stories were used in order to impress information into the human brain, into our memory circuits, as a storehouse for
And
human
how do we
knowledge.
know if we've had the story capacity before we developed language or after?
Yeah, and the answer is I don't know, and I don't know who's going to. I don't know if anyone is working on that particular question right now, or even how you would.
Brian Boyd shared with me.
How you would get
I
at it.
interviewed Brian Boyd from the University of Auckland in New Zealand.
Yep.
Last podcast episode, and
I
read
know of
his book on the evolution of story, and he makes an argument there. But after that, he published so originally in his book on the evolution of story, he gives the example of these deaf mutes. I forget if they were in Nicaragua or in Mexico, who were able to sort of put narratives even though they couldn't speak and never learned to speak, not even like by miming or, they didn't have any language whatsoever. And yet they would kind of try to verbalize or communicate a narrative of a sort. So that was some perhaps evidence that maybe it preceded. But then he wrote a paper where he tweaked his position and said that, Well, I think it's more realistic, and I think that's the most convincing part. And he goes through great extent in it that they're kind of mutually in a feedback loop. So we had like language, uh, maybe a little bit of story or a little bit of story capacity, and then a little bit of language, and then those co-evolved together in a feedback loop, mutually reinforcing each other, kind of.
And that certainly makes the most sense. That seems logical. Yeah, I've read a lot of his stuff, and my problem with his, the deaf mute, those examples, is that their brains are still a product of the DNA, of modern DNA. And
That's what I told him too. Yeah.
I mean, story literally, this is the conclusion that we can make now by looking at the physical structures that are there in the back of the brain that process in story terms. Story, the elements of story in the form of story literally are scripted into our DNA. It is who we are. That those structures, because of the way that those physical structures develop in the back in that reptilian, that early part of the brain, that subconscious part of the brain. And so, in order to really say which came first, you almost have to go back. You somehow have to go back before that statement was true, and find a way to do the research, sort of a before and then after comparison. And I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you do that. Interesting, but sort of an academic research, because the reality is that story is in our DNA. It is scripted into us. It is who we are. And the more that we acknowledge it, the more that we honor it, the more that we use it and say, hooray, we're story animals. Let's teach ourselves, let's immerse ourselves in an understanding of story to better understand who we are and how we function.
Yeah, let's talk about the implications here a little bit, because that would kind of connect us to the most important element, or one of the most important elements of story, which is the motivation. And my personal story of discovering that and getting motivated to learn about story after so many years was the fact that, and it's kind of like maybe embarrassing to say that, I've had, I'm now 46 years old, and it first started dawning on me about the importance of story maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, when I noticed, and it was maybe even before Trump, but especially during the election of Trump, that, my wife's family on her mother's side is from Rochester, New York. And Rochester used to be called Kodak City for many, many, many decades, was a very prosperous community. And once Kodak went bankrupt, it's a complete disaster. Yep. It's kind of like Detroit in many ways. Anyway, and most of her family voted for Trump. And my mother-in-law is a big, even though she's lived now more her life in Canada than in America, in the United States of America. So she's gotten her education in Canada. Like, she's married in Canada. She's had 3 kids in Canada. She considers herself an American first and foremost. And not only that, but, very kind of much Republican, proud, patriotic, American, and Trump supporter. And my, what I learned is after, because I love my mother-in-law, she's like one of the most generous, most genuine, most, amazing people that I've met in my life. But we cannot agree on any of those things, whether it's climate change, whether it's the president of the United States, whether it's, the invasion of Iraq, for example, by George Bush, which was an illegal and an immoral war in my books, just like now the invasion of Ukraine by Putin. And anyway, and what I noticed is that in conversations with her family, with my friends now, even with respect, my friends and classmates in Bulgaria, with respect to the war next door in Ukraine,
Yes.
we cannot agree on the basic facts of things. And it occurred to me that no matter how much information, knowledge, and factual data I bring to bear, it's never making any iota of a difference. And then it occurred to me
No.
that it is through stories that people frame the realm within which they assess the data, and then they discount some of it, which if it doesn't fit within their story, they either discount it or find a favorable interpretation of that same story that would validate or justify their pre-existing conclusion within their already pre-existing story framework. And that's when I started looking, okay, well, look, we have climate change. It's incontroversial. It's like indisputable, factual happening. And we know we are the cause of it. We are the engine of it. And yet, when it comes to, for example, what do we do about it? Then we start clashing, because some people say, oh, it's the greatest catastrophe, that it's self-caused, and other people say, no, it's not about that. It's about really the economy and jobs. That's what it is about. It's not about the catastrophe. It's about the catastrophe is losing jobs and not having the economy grow. So we can have the same data, but look diametrically opposed conclusions. And so that was, to me, the moment when the light bulb went off. And I'm embarrassed to say I was like 39 years old.
Don't be. I'd say most people go through their lives and that light bulb never goes off.
Well, I hope not. So, but then the question is, let us talk about the implication of story, because then there's another problem with it, and that's the fact that storytelling has a bad reputation, and especially before that, I've done 300 episodes of my podcast with some of the quote brightest and best experts around the world in many scientific disciplines, from artificial intelligence to genetics, robotics, nanotech, synthetic biology, 3D printing, and so on. And in scientific circles, storytelling has a bad reputation. Every scientist, and I'm sure you've had infinitely more experience with me about that, whether it's with global warming, whether it's with like ocean acidification, whether it's with coral bleaching or what have you. Scientists just want to talk about the data, and the moment you start telling them about, well, but what about the story? How are we going to, and they're like, wait a second, like, I'm a scientist, I don't do this. This is manipulation. This is spin doctoring, and so on. So the question is, how do we get around that kind of bad rep that storytelling seems to have acquired?
First, I tried, not real intensively, but for several years, to say, where did that come from? That reputation. Storytelling, I have been in classrooms. Literally, this has happened a number of times, and been working with students. It's happened from third graders up through middle school grades, a lot, where I'll get kids up and I'll say, okay, we're gonna make up a story. And I've had kids say, can I be excused? I don't want to do this. And I'll say, why? And they'll say, because my father tells me I'm not allowed to make up stories. What the father is saying is, what that says is the father equates story and storytelling with lying. Storytelling also gets equated with fiction. Story with fiction. Well, where did that come about? If it's true that for 150,000 years, plus or minus, we have used story and storytelling as vehicles for communicating essential community, societal, personal information, for communicating it and for archiving it, then where did this sudden flip happen? It seems to date and spread from England in the 1600s at some point. And I'd have to do a lot more work, and I just haven't taken the time or effort to go do it to try to pinpoint it anymore, where that flip seemed to happen, and it happened around the time of the Reformation, when suddenly uh, religious information from the Catholic Church, dominant force at that time in Europe, that was truth, and everything else was fiction. And so that seems to be the linchpin that started this idea of story being fiction, story being lies, because it was different than the truth, than the church's version of
Wow.
things. And again, it would take more research to actually pin that down, but that seems to be where the research that was able to do seems to be pointing. So we have this belief that's very deep-seated. It's easy when you get on a one-on-one with someone to demonstrate how meaningless it is, and how incorrect those beliefs are, and that no one really, none of the people you're talking to really believe it at all anyway. It's not a conscious decision. It's down at a very subconscious societal level that we have those truths. Let me do one other thing before we get to what do you do about it, just to show you how powerful that sense is, that we tend to interpret incoming information to support our existing beliefs. This was a study by the National Institutes of Health. Now, gosh, 12 years ago, I think. They were worried that more and more families were opting out of that basic 3 cocktail immunization you give to your kids early on, the rubella and that one, and so wanted to do a study to see why were people opting out of it, and got 2,000 couples who either just had or were just about to have their first child. Split them in half. Half, they just followed them. And the question was, were they going to get the vaccinations or weren't they? No influence, no direct contact, just followed them. The other half met with each of them and showed them the studies that said how safe the vaccinations were, and how the only study that ever concluded that that vaccinations either retard the natural development of the immune system or cause autism, which is a big one, came out of one study in England. And 3 years after he did the initial study, the author of that study rebuked his own study and said, I was faking data. That's not true. And yet still the studies lived on. So all these studies, and followed them. Conclusion, the group that had been given the information wound up being 34% less likely to immunize their children than the parents who were given nothing. Now, what unfortunately the National Institutes of Health didn't do, but a couple of other researchers did a little bit of, was to go back to all of those people and say, what happened? And those that were interviewed afterwards, who had gotten the information, tended to retain a couple of bits of information, a couple of conclusions from that research, from that exposure. One was, gee, if there's been research, there must be some danger. If there hadn't been a danger to the immunizations, they wouldn't have done the research in the first place. Vague. The other one was, most of the people said, yes, I was so glad that the researchers showed me that information that explained how dangerous the immunizations are. And when the researchers then said, no, that's not what they showed you, and brought out the exact same studies, brought out all the exact same information and laid it on the table, those parents tended to say, this must be different studies. The ones I was shown before concluded that the vaccinations were dangerous. So what that says is that the most powerful technique that comes out of story research, I mean, other than understanding the structure of stories, is the sense of story reframing. You cannot, you will not change someone's stories by saying your story is wrong and here's the correct story. And every human being you go to, even if it's on a topic that they claim to know nothing about, is going to have a story in their mind, a preconceived notion. And in order to change that story, information alone will not change someone's story. Why? Because information alone, a story, we are engaged in stories, and the way we're able to define engagement is emotionally laden attention. There is an emotional component that is an essential part of being engaged. Information alone will not engage because it doesn't emotionally involve us. Attention being prolonged mental focus over time. That's attention. So what we have to do is understand the story that our target audience has in their minds and reframe that story, not deny it, not attack it, but show how to shift certain elements in the story to come to a different conclusion. Look at the story a slightly different way and come to a conclusion. And there are lots of examples of story reframing having amazingly powerful effect.
So help me out here.
Go
we
ahead.
have the story of Let's Make America Great Again. You know, great story. I for one, I got nothing against it. I mean, sure, let's make a.
Oh, I do.
Well, okay, you can tell me that, but generally, like in principle, I don't mind America or Russia or any country, China being great again. I do mind many of the ideas or proposed solutions associated with that kind of general umbrella. So how do we go and reframe the associations between the two so that we are still working within the umbrella of let's make America great again? Because I have nothing against, America being prosperous and a shining light of democracy for the world, but show that the actions proposed, if there were any, and the person supposedly proposing those actions are, for lack of better term, false prophets. How do we reframe that? Because I failed miserably. I understood the story. I understood their story, and yet I failed to break through.
You see, this again, stories happen in the mind of the receiver. And so the target audience for that story were Americans who were disgruntled by the direction of the country.
Rochester is a perfect example of that. They used to have great lives.
And so what the Make America Great Again, what the story is America is not great now. And the reason it is not great is because my opponent and that party let it crumble. So that the story isn't about America being great. It's about America falling into ungreatness. America no longer being great. That's what the story is. And I now identified the culprit. And the culprit, the reason it's not great is my opponent let it slip, let America slide, and let America falter. And so to reframing a story, what's a good example that's easy to understand, that's easy to see? Change stories. Companies are always worried about the change stories. And change stories are, we think of, something's going to change, it's going to get bad. The change stories aren't about change. Change stories are about preservation. Why do we change anything? Because there's something else that's more precious that we want to preserve and protect. A change story isn't about things having to change. They're about the glorious things we're going to preserve. And as soon as you get the audience to think about that, then change becomes not an evil thing, but it becomes the vehicle for preserving what is most important to us. So partly to understand a story like Make America Great Again, to really to not be affected by it, to not be swayed by it, means you have to understand what the story is in terms of its target audience. All stories, effective stories, are target audience specific. And so understanding the audience and then the message to that audience, and then you can say, do I agree with the message being delivered to that audience? Am I part of that audience? If it's being delivered to me, what is it that's really being said here? More basic than reframing than any other technique is understanding what it is that story does and what are the elements of story that let it do what it does. Then we can start to talk about, well, how do you take the story that someone hears and reframe it? And since I've gone into reframing so much, I need to do it. Do we have time for a quick example? This is going to be the assessor of a major Western American city, which is in Arizona, but I won't name the actual city. He is an elected position. What does the assessor do? He assigns the value of property for taxation purposes. So, and he got elected. It was an elected position in the state of Arizona, and he was talking about how he was going to reform the office of the assessor and make it more user-friendly and make it more accessible and blah, blah, blah. And now he's up for re-election, and he hadn't done anything. But just before he was starting to run for re-election, he'd gotten a large grant from the state of Arizona and said, I'm going to completely revamp the computer system in the office and integrate it. And instead of having cars drive up and down the street and every 4 or 5 years stop and from the street take a picture of a building and use that as the basic for adjusting its assessment, I have a fleet of planes that will fly over every property in this county. It's a county thing, and take pictures, for aerial pictures, accurate to like an eighth of an inch, and we'll use those to adjust it. And anyone who challenges an assessment, which at the time was taking 2 or 3 years to adjudicate, he said, I have a fleet of, I'm going to have a fleet of drones. Within 1 hour of you filing an assessment, a complaint, I'll have a drone flying over that property that can take photographs of every structure, every development on that property, accurate to within a 16th of an inch. We'll have it back, and within another hour after that, we'll process and deliver the adjudication on it. And he thought, everyone's going to love this. Everyone's going to love this, that I'm going to get reelected. And so he started to roll out his talks and talk about all this new technology he was going to do. And his numbers tanked, and he started to get death threats. This is in Western, Arizona, the Old West. So death, if someone says they're going to shoot you in the Old West, you take it very seriously. And he started to get booed. And that's when he came to me and he said, I don't get it. This is what 4 years, when I ran the first time, this is what they said they wanted. And I said, well, let's look at the story that they're hearing, and then see if we can adjust the story. I mean, I was pretty sure I knew exactly what was going on, but I told him that it would take a lot of study, and so it's going to be a huge, big budget that we'd have to fork over to do this study. So I went and interviewed a few people in his target audiences and said to get the story so he was trying to tell the story about himself and doing his job. The story that they heard wasn't about him. They didn't care about him. They cared about property owners. Why? That's what they are. And what they heard him saying is they were going to up their taxes. because he wasn't going to lower property values. He was going to increase. Now he doesn't set the tax rate. I mean, he doesn't set the tax burden. County does, and then he just disperses it equitably across all property values according to their individual relative value. And so what they heard him saying was, I'm going to use all this technology to catch cheaters, people who have tried to develop anything on their property without filing for permits and paying fees, and I'm going to up your
send
taxes.
spy planes and spy drones to spy on your property.
And spy plane. And so they started to say, yeah, if we see one of those planes or those drones in our neighborhood, we're going to shoot it down. And I said, it's about the story. You want to tell the story of this technology so that it makes sense to those people? I said, you're not going to change the main character. They're going to hear the story about themselves, so change the goal. And I said, reframe the goal. The goal of the character, your goal was to do your job better. Well, they don't care about that. They care about themselves and paying less tax. So change the goal of the main character that you talk about. And you want to say, you don't want to pay someone else's taxes, do you? If someone cheats and develops something on their property and doesn't file the permits and doesn't register it with the assessor's office, part of their share of the taxes in future years will be paid by somebody else who doesn't cheat, who pays. So I said, start every speech from that moment on with, you don't want to pay someone else's taxes, do you? I know I don't. And everyone agreed with him. And then he went into so he reframed the story so that in story terms, he had originally done the story about himself as the main character. And his lack of technology is the big problem he had to solve. And what his audience heard in their minds, because they wanted to make the story about them, they flipped him from the main character to being the antagonist. He was the bad guy who was going to catch them. And by reframing the story, he took him out of the story, that part of the story, and put a cheater in as the antagonist, the bad guy who was going to make honest citizens pay more in the stories. And all of a sudden, as soon as he started that, the death stopped, and his numbers started to climb, and he got himself reelected. It's about taking the story and saying, what story do I want? What is the essential story that my audience has to hear? What are they likely to hear? And how do I structure my story so that we take the facts? In this case, it was, we have a new computer system that integrated across the assessor's office. We have planes, we have drones. Facts. How do we create the story so that it sends the message you want to create? That's where stories really have this amazing power. They take facts and create context for those facts that creates meaning. And it is the meaning that you need to get across. When people misuse story, it's because they try to force a meaning on it that ultimately is isn't beneficial for the target audience, or is unfairly beneficial for the person.
Yeah, that's propaganda. That's like the definition of propaganda.
And that's propaganda. So in order to counter propaganda, you need to have a body of people who understand story structure so they can recognize it for what it is and recognize how to reframe it to make it make sense.
So how do we do that, either in the case of like, let's make America great again so that I can get through my relatives and my mother-in-law, or for example, let's take the even more important example perhaps with global warming. You know, in Canada here in the West, we have the province of Alberta, which produces the dirtiest oil in the world. Right. And so every time, whether the prime minister or I go somewhere to speak there as a keynote speaker, and I say something about climate change, and I say something about moving to alternative energy sources, whatever I may say, people hear, this guy wants me to be unemployed. This guy wants me to be
Yep.
out of business. This guy wants me to be on social security or, unemployment benefits and stuff like that. This guy wants to ruin me, basically. That's what these people hear. How do we reframe that in their mind?
Right. Okay. And the question is, climate change is. That's not the question. The question is, what is it that your target audience
Jobs.
values more deeply than anything? Jobs is one. There are family-related things. There's having a safe and secure world for their children and grandchildren. There are a number of values. There's a number of attitudes that those people hold. I mean, the jobs one. Climate change creates jobs. That's most of the research that's been done, and there is a fair amount of it, says that climate change opens up technologies that create jobs. And for every job that gets closed down, there are one or two that open up. So that what those people are saying, if they're really saying, "Oh, you're trying to take my job away from me," yes, they're trying to take that job away from you. Financial insecurity, what they're talking about is financial insecurity, loss of prestige, loss of status, loss
they're
of
seeing that they have a
seniority.
job that makes them $200,000 right now, being a roughneck
Dollars
on an
a-
oil rig
right.
in the middle of nowhere, right? You can't make $200,000 like that easy. And then
Nope.
someone says, well, you're going to
No,
get another job
but
in alternative energy. Where? Like, I have a good job right now. I don't want another job. I want to keep this one.
right. Exactly. And to a certain extent, as is with the taxes, you're not going to have people suddenly say, "Oh, hooray! Yes, close down my oil well, close down this refinery." But the question is to find values that are deeper. That's the change story. A company, we need to get off of oil as an energy source. Okay, well, why do we have to get off of oil?
To
Answer
preserve
that one. Why do we have to get
the
off of oil?
future of my children, so that my children, and I don't have children, but I'm looking at it from a Calgarian cattle rancher who's had a ranch for 7 generations in their family from the early 1800s, and who has 8,000 heads of cattle, and in the meantime supplements his farming with a couple of oil rigs on his property, and so he derives his income from there. And so I guess the reframing would be you want to protect this landscape and this land for your future grandchildren, so that they can enjoy this land
right.
like you did. And to do that, we have to change this, which is to say, shift away from oil, maybe consider, different kind of ranching rather than cattle.
It's to make the future vision of the alternatives both real and personal. What does it look like when tropical diseases suddenly arrive in Canada that have never been into Canada before? What does it look like when food supplies are shifting and suddenly food is insecure and price of food quadruples or goes up tenfold? What is it? It's to make people see at the root values that they hold, that in order to preserve those root values, something else is going to change. And if we change this something else, it's going to preserve what's most important to me. Will you reach everyone? No. Will that roughneck who's getting $200,000 a year on oil wells really buy into it? No, because they're bearing an undue share of the cost because they just happen to be where they are. Um, but you can mollify some of that sense of loss by showing what else would get lost if we don't change. That is to say, the
So
effect on their children, the effect
many
on
of
their
those
family.
roughnecks are, for
So
example, from Newfoundland or Nova Scotia, from a fishing community. And so
Mhm.
because the Great Banks got overfished, they couldn't sustain their living with fish anymore. So now they're forced to go all the way west to work on an oil rig and then fly home.
Wow.
So then maybe we do something like your wife and your family and your father's home would be underwater, and you would lose the memories. You would lose the land where you grew up as a child, and your children would never play in the same places that you played and hunt in the same places that you hunted with your dad because of climate change and because of ocean.
Because of, and actually, looking at the fisheries is a great example. We didn't preserve and make sustainable those fisheries. So now for the next, I don't know, 40, 50 years, we'd have to lay off of them. I don't know how many years, it's probably not that long, before those fisheries could recover to and be reproductive again. In the same way, if we don't preserve the climate in a more general sense, what else are you going to lose? What else do you stand to lose? And start to go through they see the immediate gain, dollars in their pockets. They don't see the cost that they're paying for that gain, and they don't see, therefore they can't see the value of preserving those things that would be lost, that are of great value to them. That's where story can come in. It's a cost benefit analysis that you're
I'm
doing in
starting
story
to
terms.
see inways in, or what I believe are inways. And in a way, we have to show them that the change that they need to do has lower cost than the value of what they want to preserve. In other words, changing your job on a oil rig as a roughneck may cost you so much, but not doing that would cost your children infinitely more. They'll never hunt with you the way you hunted with your dad. They'll never go fishing in the Great Banks like you went fishing with your dad when you were their age. They'll never be able to play, in the Bay of Fundy because the water would raise, even more so than it's risen now, and the flooding would take off the family cottage, and et cetera, et cetera. So we can, okay, I think I'm starting to get it a little better.
So it is a sense of, looking at more than just that one area in isolation. In this case,
You
I
have to
lose my
broaden the
job.
frame, in other words.
You have to broaden the frame and bring in other values, other beliefs that are more fundamental. What happens to your community? What happens to the country? The consequences of global warming, certainly in terms of human migration and human displacement, will be catastrophic. It's going to make it very likely to make the displacement around World War II seem trivial.
Yeah.
And so how much of that will affect their communities, their family? I mean, you can go through all of the ways that climate change affects human beings, and virtually none of them are positive.
Yeah.
And it's a question of letting them, using story to make those costs seem real and personal and vivid in people's minds. That's what stories do.
So, Kendall, we've been talking now for a couple of hours, but there's still so many things I want to get through. So I'm going to try and see if we can pick up the pace a little bit. Let's talk a little more about story as a social event, because it's very important, I think, and it kind of may shed light. So this kind of my hidden agenda, just like you and my previous interviewee pointed out the weakness or the flaws of my definition of story or the insufficiency of it. Let me bring in my kind of setup or context within which I'm kind of situating the book that I'm working on. And I want to bring that by starting to talk about story as a social event. Tell me about people reacting more powerfully as part of an audience versus people reacting less powerfully to the same story when that story is being told one-on-one. Why is that the case? I mean, we all have anecdotal evidence based on, a football stadium. When you go, for the Super Bowl and you're in the stadium, it's completely different.
Sure.
The same. You've been in the army. I've been in the army. It's one thing to be alone, stuck in the middle of nowhere of a field and like scoping out the situation. It's another thing to be with 30, 50 or 100 or 2,000 of your buddies and marching and just like hitting the ground and you go 10 levels up probably, or at least you feel like you do. It's like totally different.
We definitely are influenced. Our interpretation of experience is influenced by those around us. It's true, by the way that they are reacting. And so there is partly a comparison going on. How am I reacting? And how are they reacting? They being the people around me. Am I reacting the way they are? And so does their reaction reinforce my reaction? Or does it contradict my reaction? I can say it this way. There are many situations where if you don't strongly agree with the people around you, if, for example, continuing on our last topic, if you were in a crowd of climate deniers, what your reaction would be tend to close down, to back off, and so that their reaction would make you would shut down your responses, not amplify them, not build on them. Yes, you are affected by the people around you and their reaction to a story, and you use it some to adjust your reactions to the story. Do they see something I don't see? Do they anticipate something I don't see? What is it they're anticipating? Let me think for a minute. Oh, wait a minute. I think I get where they're going with the story. But at the same time, it can be a multiplicative effect. Amplify your reaction to the story if you perceive that your reaction to the story matches that of the majority of the crowd around you. It tends to amplify your response. If you perceive otherwise, it, I think, tends to diminish and reduce the emotional component of your response.
So for example,
it's a factor, but it's not only it's not necessarily one directional.
Sure. But for example, when we have the presidential elections in the United States, my mother-in-law, not during COVID times, but before that, she would want to go somewhere with my people, even though she's at home and she loves her family and her kids and us and all of that. None of us agree or embrace her politics. So she wants to go somewhere where she has her kind of people, the Republicans, the Americans.
Right. Where her responses will be amplified, or her responses, so where rather than feeling defensive about her responses, she can feel exuberant and enthusiastic about her natural responses and her natural feelings. And sure, That absolutely. The crowd phenomenon. Crowds will do things that individuals will never wouldn't do in their
Right.
whole
So you
lifetime.
have what I'm trying to push here, and probably not in, I didn't probably approach it in the best way possible, is that you have this kind of a shared story between these separate communities. And, just like some, biologists have observed that grooming is the glue that holds ape society together. For example, how apes groom each other is what holds their troops and their ape society together. My claim is perhaps, and that story is the glue that holds human society together. And
I
so
agree.
my whole sort of framework or context of the book that I'm working on, it so far it's called Rewriting the Human Story, How Our Story Determines Our Future, is based on what, and at the time I didn't even know that it was defined like that, but basically I observed the same phenomenon that Jonas Sachs observed in his book, The Upcoming Story Wars, and he coined the term the myth gap, which he defined as the space between the realities of our moment in history and the shared stories to which we turn for explanation, meaning, and instruction for action. So what I observed is that, stories are like our GPS. They're like our framework. They tell us who we are, where we're coming from, where we're going, what's right, what's wrong, whom we should marry, what we should eat, what we should not do, what happens to us when we die, where we go, what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to bring our children. All of that is given to us via story. And it struck me that our stories that have brought us thus far are now falling apart. They're failing because the gap between our observed reality and the capacity of our stories, which are very powerful and have taken us, to the 21st century and have allowed us to send stuff to Mars and outside of the solar system, but now they're failing to create the framework within which we can even acknowledge, let alone start resolving some major problems that we're facing today as a civilization. And so my response to that has been that unless we reframe the stories, which I didn't know that even before I read your book, but that was kind of my own independent conclusion, is that unless we come up with new stories that would allow us to look at the same data and observe the same problems that we've observed so far, but would allow us the possibility to consider new solutions that the current stories don't even allow us to see as potentialities anymore. So unless we come up with new stories, we're kind of not going in a good direction. In the 21st century, maybe either our last century, or maybe if not the end of humanity as a species, maybe the end of us as a civilization at the planetary level. Because if you look at our institutions are falling apart, our politics are falling apart, there's so many things, everything around us is lacking any sense anymore. And the reason why it lacks sense is because we don't have a good story that would allow us to make sense of what happens now, why it's happening, and what could happen next, and instruct us, most importantly, of what to do about it and how, so that we have a positive end. We have an up, we look up rather than down. Right now, the current story that prevails is all one of maybe gloom and doom, environmental collapse, war in Europe for the first time since World War II, the potential of World War III at the nuclear level, higher than it's ever been for the last 70 years, potentially equal, if not higher, than the Cuban Missile Crisis. So
up there.
My conclusion was that we need a new story. That's kind of my thesis of the book, and what pushed me to go into this whole thing on story. And then, of course, artificial intelligence is what I've been working on for all these years and what I've been all about, transhumanism, which, by the way, is all derived from the story of humanism, right? So transhuman is basically taking another step from above human, the logical continuation, or the teleological continuation, as Aristotle would say. So we are humans. We've been using science and technology to get to where we are. And as Stuart Brand would say, you know, we might as well behave as gods because now we are as powerful as them. And then transhumanism jumps in and says, and tomorrow we're going to have physical immortality, and we're going to have almighty, omnipotent, ever-present, all-knowing artificial intelligence, and we're even going to merge with them. So we're really going to become gods, and we're going to design our own selves for immortality and all powerfulness and all knowledge and eternal life. And, you know, we'll live longer than the sun, and we'll survive and, you know, populate the universe. All of those ideas, the singularity and Ray Kurzweil, all of that. So what do you make of kind of my struggle to make sense of this predicament that humanity is making with, is dealing with right now, and my kind of proposal to solve it by coming up, or as I say, rewriting the human story, because the current human story has brought us thus far, but is no longer serving us.
Clearly, yeah, I agree that we're shifting the kinds of stories. Certainly, now this is in the West. I don't know that this is global. I don't know that this is true everywhere. But the trend is to go away from collective stories into more smaller tribal stories that are more microscopic and less collective. So as that, but this isn't the first time in the history of the world that that's been true. There are even bigger shifts in the collective, certainly the Western story over time. Rationalism, when it came in and replaced faith-based beliefs, that was a huge shift in the way people looked at
you can
themselves
say
and at the
that
world
the
and
human
at society.
story for thousands of years was religion, and then during the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, that story of religion as the guiding story of humanity was replaced by the story of rationality, science, and progress.
Yep. And I think I've noticed over the last decade that there is a huge shift. Certainly it started before that, but there's been a huge shift away from rationalism back toward faith-based, but not necessarily religious-based story belief, so that you can have two separate groups of facts, because I take these I take these facts to as part of my belief system. And why do I believe it? Because the person I believe said it. So that rational empirical evidence and logic are less important, because they are becoming less and less and less the basis for making our decisions and creating our stories. So I don't like that trend. I think it's counterproductive. I don't think it helps anybody, but it certainly is the current direction and trend in the world's story. And if you know how to change it, I think that's a great thing. And I think that's something that we need. I can certainly observe what's going on and observe that the stories that we have used, certainly for the past 70, 80 years, aren't having the same impact and the same effect that they have always had. I believe that the underlying values, principles, attitudes are still there that can be reformed into a new story. It's not that those have
Sure, yeah.
radically changed. But I suspect that the news stories have to account for new stresses and new threats. Stories, I mean, why did Romans and Greeks create gods? Because there are aspects of the world they couldn't understand, so they created gods to be able to explain them, so that they could live more comfortable lives. So we had a god created thunder. Why? Because gods do that. And so now I understand thunder. So now I don't have to worry about why is there thunder and lightning, and why are there floods, and why are there droughts. Gods create those. Well, and those stories then help people live better lives. Stories are supposed to help us live better lives. What we need is some new stories that play off of those same needs, those same very basic levels of needs and values and wants, and help us live better lives at this time in this
The main
in this
function
situation
I'm
in the world.
looking for or effect is cooperation, because we've gotten to the point where cooperation seems to be, diminishing at the global level and threatened physically in many cases, like in Europe now with the war in the Ukraine. And
Sure.
what I'm trying to come up is with a narrative that would motivate not only to restore the previous levels of cooperation, but to go to a new level. Because right now, the kinds of problems that we're facing, whether climate change, whether nuclear weapons, whether artificial intelligence, whether genetic manipulation, whether ocean acidification, whether species extinction, those are all problems that cannot be solved individually, but we need collective cooperative action to solve them. And the only way you can accomplish
Right.
that is within a framework of a story. So
Yep.
I'm looking for that story that would motivate and bring people together
Here's-
and create that.
Here's the possibly the antithesis. The way to find that story is to look at the antithesis story, which is, gee, we have too many people. People are the threat. So it's not, cooperation. No, what I need to do is isolate myself from the fact that there are now too many
Sure.
people on the planet. And so if you can, that undercurrent is I think the underpinning for tribalism. There's us and there's them. And them is a threat because there are too many of them. They're trying to take over wherever we live. They'll move in. They'll overpopulate. They'll run us out. And I think the seeds for the story you're looking for might lie in understanding how to counter the seeds of that narrative, that story that says people are a threat because they're just too many of them now, and then they're all over, and they'll overrun me and they'll overrun my people if we let them. Figure out how to counter that thought, and you'll have the seeds for the story that you're looking for.
That's great. So that's indeed the survivalist or the individualist Malthusian argument made modern. Now we have all these communities of people, who you have to have 3 months supply of food, you have to have your ammunition, your AR-15, and just like in case the zombie apocalypse comes, I have all the food and I have all the ammo I need to protect myself, and I know how to survive in the forest or this and that. So yeah, that's a good point. But then, so I'll think about that. But my concern is with one of the legitimate criticisms that I got is that, in a way, what I'm trying to do and what I've been doing, because I've been running a lot of anecdotal tests. I wrote a draft proposal that I ran during an art exhibit in Switzerland, in Basel, with a couple of hundred people. I did a couple of readings here in Toronto and another couple of places. And some people, most people loved it, but I got 2 places where it was lacking. The first one is like, people love the fact that I'm giving like the history of everything through story. In other words, story is embedded in everything. Is like the story of everything as story. Like I make story the fundamental element of analysis, at my book. And the first criticism is this: is story like a universal hammer, and therefore everywhere you look around in the world, all you see is like nails? And my response to that was like, well, that's legit, but here's the way I see it. It's like math. To me, story is like math. Math has limitations. Math has serious, we have the Gödel's theorem, right? We have certain things that you cannot do with math and certain limitations. But yet math is one of the most powerful scientific tools we have. So my argument is the same about story. Story has limitations. And one of the major ones, perhaps, is the fact that it pertains to the human species most than any other species, perhaps, that we know of, at least.
See, I would say that's not necessarily true. We apply it to human beings. It's not that's not a characteristic of story. That's a characteristic of human beings. I would also say that story and math are very similar. And a lot of what I've been doing the last few years is being floored by the number of ways in which story is mathematical. And math can describe story in the same way that, in many ways, story is what makes sense of and describes what math does. So they are both ways of viewing the world, and in that sense, my goodness, they're incredibly powerful tools, because they describe the world in ways that resonate within the human brain.
What particularly struck me was that it was Brian Boyd who was the source of that criticism, that maybe I'm over, like that I'm seeing story as a hammer in the world full of nails. And I was like, wow, I didn't expect that from him. So if he tells me that I'm over interpreting the power of story, then I'm very careful. Like, am I? Are we?
But see, his criticism is a story.
All criticisms are a story.
It's in story form. And so it almost is self-defeating. His criticism is self-defeating in that, in order to criticize, he had to use story in order to criticize you and your use of story. Yeah, because
we have to have the story of the hammer and the story of the nails before, sure.
The story of the nails. And then the story that it's not just that a hammer looks for a nail. Hammer looks only for nails, and a hammer assumes that the world is made up of nails. That's Saul's story.
And the other criticism that I got was, so I finished my first test draft with the idea, basically be the author of your own story. We need a diversity, a mosaic of stories that mutually, peacefully coexist and cohabitate together. And then people were like, okay, great, but give me the story. I was like, but the whole point is like, be the author of your story. So if I give you the story, it's not your story, it's my story. They're like, yeah, that's great. Give me the story.
Yeah. And I agree. And I don't think that if people say that, I think that's a positive. That's a good thing, because what that says is they're looking for that framework that lets their own individual stories suddenly fall into some context and make sense. And
exactly, that was my conclusion.
So I think that, if anything, is encouragement for you to continue to work on how do we form that story. That becomes maybe the way to create that story is to try to do it collectively. I mean, which is where you want to go with the story, is that our story has to be, it's a collective process. Forming that story is a collective process. It's not my story. It's not your story.
Exactly
it's our
right.
story.
Yeah,
that you're going
because
for?
the first part of my book is called Story, which is where your book comes to be very helpful, because we're looking at the definition of story. We define what story is, how it works, and go through all the science. The second part of the book is called Our Story, which basically talks about the story of humanity, and I identify 4 parts of it. The last part is the becoming. The fourth part is like the becoming God's story, which the transhumanist narrative story has brought us to. And now the third part of the book is rewriting the new story. And that's where I need to give the new story, that new framework. And so I got the first 2 parts. The third part is where I'm really struggling with and trying to figure out what's the framework that would create.
And it may be that, that it's not the story you want to create, it's the framework by which people gather together to create the story. And if you provide the framework, then the story itself, which isn't a static thing, the story that you're talking about is an ongoing, evolving, living, breathing entity that is always evolving and refreshing itself, and it may be the most powerful thing is the tools and the techniques to evolve that story in a continuously productive, beneficial way. Because periodically, the story of humanity, our collective story,
Is
keeps
rewritten.
taking these quick left turns into conflict, into war, into genocide, into all sorts of places where no one really wanted it to go. And the question is, well, how do you keep evolving the story and keep it going in a more productive way to avoid those catastrophes that seem to come up very periodically? And rather than the story itself, it's the tools and the techniques for evolving, controlling, letting the story grow and continue that may be the most powerful thing you can create.
It has to be a framework which allows the mutual peaceful coexistence of mutually exclusive stories. A place where Republicans and Democrats, Russians
Very
and
good.
Ukrainians, Jews and Arabs can kind of peacefully coexist. Like the World Cup in a way. Like, we accept the story of what the World Cup is in soccer, and we may not accept the result that when Germany wins, Brazil is not happy about it, but they recognize the legitimacy of the outcome because they recognize the story about the rules, and most importantly, the conflict resolution mechanism embedded in the story through the referee. Instead of going on the pitch with AK-47s or tanks, we cheer with our flags, and maybe we'll swear against the referee, but we'll accept his judgment ultimately.
Or sneaking on 3 extra players to, you're right, we accept, and it is those rules that make the game acceptable. And it's maybe finding those rules that we all need to agree on.
So, Kendall, we've been talking here for a very long time, 2.5 hours. I know that you have to run. So can you please quickly tell us what's the best place for people to find more about you and your work?
Being a confirmed Luddite as I am, I do have a website. And I never go there and I don't follow it. But KendallHaven.com is the best place to find out about me. Probably the best place is out on the website, out on the line, where what other people have posted, because they do a much better job of posting than I do.
Storyproof, fantastic book, absolutely must read.
And story.
Now, final question, Kendall. We've covered a wide variety of topics today. What's the best message or story that you want to send us away with?
We are story animals. Story is how we make sense of the world. That's not a bad thing. That's a very good thing. but it requires that every human being, as part of being a human being, become aware of what story is and how story works. The more you're aware of story, the more it's a powerful constructive tool and the less it's a destructive tool in the world. So that, and we can now, we can, that's not theoretical anymore. It's not hyperbole. Story is woven into our DNA. We are story. That's now science. That's now pretty much accepted fact. So the question is only for all of us to, as responsible human beings, to embrace it and use story in a productive,
And you know, I
constructive
opened up
way.
our conversation today with a quote about stories being like books of famous chess games, which reminds me to what historian and sci-fi author Ada Palmer said on my show once about science fiction, because she said science fiction fights our ethical battles before we have to fight them. I think that's what good stories allow us to do
That's
too.
what's absolutely
Kendall
it is.
Haven, thank you so much for
Absolutely
being
it
with
is.
us today.
My pleasure. Absolute pleasure. And I look forward to our next conversation.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.